I'm Casey, and I don't know what I'm doing. Today I'm going to try to do a rapid fire round of February wrap up because I have stuff I have to be doing in about 15 minutes. So we're going to see if I can't just knock this out very quickly so that I'm not late getting to the obligations I already have. The order I'm going to talk about these books is the order that I read them in. I would try to do something clever, but I don't really have the time to organize these the way I would want to if I was doing something more clever than, just in sequential order. Okay, the first book that I read and finished in the month of February is Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. I read this for the book club my husband and I do with his parents. This was a selection that my mother-in-law picked, and this was absolutely incredible. This was my second 5-star book of the year, I believe. This was absolutely amazing. I cried. It was very moving. I thought it was very beautifully written. Really quickly, let me tell you what this is about. This is about Dana, a modern black woman in 1976, I believe, who is thrown back in time to the antebellum South. She seems to be tied to a young boy named Rufus, and their fates are somehow interwoven, and she has to figure out why she's sent back in time, or at least have some purpose for this strange thing that's happening to her. This was absolutely incredible. This was written, I believe, in 1979, or at least published in 1979. One of the things that I think all of us found the most fascinating about this is that it reads very differently from a lot of other science fiction contemporaries. I've read not a whole terrible lot, but a decent portion of science fiction written around the same time, and it's all very straightforward. Almost. It's very direct in its prose. This had much more of a modern feel to it. I knew this was written I knew that this was written a while back, but you could have told me that this was written in, 2005, and I absolutely would have believed you. It really astounded me that this was written published, I should say, in 1979. It reads much more like a modern science fiction than it does like one published in that time period. But this was absolutely beautiful. It was so moving, and it was just amazing, and it was a great book for discussion. So if you're looking for a book for a book club that will inspire a lot of conversation, this is one I would highly recommend. The next book I read was The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. This is a short story. I don't know that this is classified as a novella. I believe it's a short story. This is about a woman who, I believe in the early 19th century, not 19th, excuse me, the early 20th century, is prescribed rest and relaxation for her hysteria, and her, I believe he's a psychiatrist, husband basically locks her into a house with very little human interaction. This one I gave 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. I think it's absolutely a classic for a reason. I listened to the audiobook version of this, and it's obviously very short. I think this was maybe 45 minutes in total. It might have actually even been half of that. I can't immediately recall. But it's really, it's such a beautifully written horror short story. And you just get to watch this woman you get to watch this woman's mental state just slowly devolve into something that could have easily been prevented had modern medicine been much more attuned to the actual needs of people versus just the kind of nonsense it was at the time. The next book that I read was Brute by Emily Skaja. This is a book of poetry, and you can see here, I'm not sure how easily you can tell, there were several of these poems that really did speak to me, and I marked them. This deals a lot with grief and violence and abuse, and in particular the ones about grief really spoke to me. This is the wrong day to talk about this, isn't it? But the ones about grief really spoke to me quite a bit, and they really pulled at my heartstrings. I ended up giving this 4 stars overall. There were a lot of these poems that didn't really speak to me, but you could tell how much the author put of herself into her work, and I always think that's very commendable, especially in poetry. The next book that I finished was Cabal by Clive Barker. This was a holdout from January. I started this, I think, in the last few days of January, and I just didn't finish it before the end of the month. This is about a man named Boone, who is in a very rough place in life with his mental health and his physical well-being, and he tries to run away from everything and isn't quite successful, and ends up finds a group of people who I'm pretty sure are called the Nightbreed in a city called Midian, and his life changes forever. This was very disappointing to me. It started really interesting. I really liked the first couple of chapters quite a bit, and I really thought, this is going to be full spoilers, by the way, and I apologize for that, but I'm trying to do this rapidly. I wanted more from Boone's perspective. I really enjoyed his perspective in the first couple chapters, but it just switches over to focus on Lori, who is his girlfriend, love interest, romantic partner. I'm not sure what they would have labeled themselves as. And I found that it really took quite a turn when it moved to her perspective. She was kind of a poorly written female character, and it made her perspective really frustrating. She's also the audience's surrogate for the narrative. She doesn't know anything about what's happening, whereas Boone Boone knew about Midian, and he, not necessarily about the Nightbreed, but he knew about Midian, and he knew this was a place he could try to find safe haven in, but Lori knows nothing. And so I understand why it switches to her perspective primarily, because she does serve as the audience surrogate for us to find everything out through. But she was just kind of annoying, and it was very frustrating to read from her perspective. There was so often where it felt like she didn't have any understanding, or she didn't even begin to try to accept that reality was very different than what she had grown up thinking it was. And it was so frustrating trying to read about like these big plot moments that were happening, and you kind of find things out, but to me as a reader, it felt like I already had figured out that this was where it was headed, and we had to suffer through a couple paragraphs of these major reveals happening that as a reader I had already figured out, but I didn't mind it being a reveal in the story. But she treated it like, oh my goodness, this couldn't be happening to me, this can't be real, and it kind of made it a slog to read. This was the start of a couple of books where it felt like the author didn't quite know how to write female characters talking about their genitals, or vagina havers talking about their genitals, and consistently we would have erections or penises talked about in almost this kind of like poetic romanticized writing, but we just have to talk about the vagina as a cunt. And I found that very frustrating. It started with this book, it happens I think once or twice in here, and it was very frustrating. Overall, this was very disappointing to me. Oh, and the plot overall just kind of lagged out by the end. It became almost comical in what the villain wanted to do and how he was achieving these goals, and it was very frustrating overall. This was 2 stars for me, and I hope that the next Clive Barker I read is going to be a bit better than this. The next book that I finished was another January holdout, and that was Brand New Cherry Flavor by Todd Grimson. I picked this up from my local library on Libby. I was very interested in watching the show, and once I found out that it was a book originally, I went to read the book first. That was a mistake. This was a 1-star book. This had misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, racism, the R slur. It just had it all. It was a big old throwing everything in the kitchen sink of nastiness and nonsense into one book form. And the worst part is it was 19 hours long. I should have given up on this maybe around the 33% mark, but I didn't. I persevered, and I really shouldn't have. I should not have pushed through to finish this book, but I did, and I hated it. It was awful. It is in the contenders for the worst books I've read this year so far. I rarely have more than one star in a year, and I've already had 2 1-stars this year, and it's very frustrating for me. But this was bad. The protagonist, Lisa, is written so poorly. The plot just stops moving at about the 60% mark. It's really ridiculous. To get into a little bit of spoilers here, the main antagonist, Boro, at around the 60-65% mark, dies, and the plot just ceases moving. It just, throughout the entirety of it so far, it had been such a bunch of just, it had been a cavalcade of B-movie violence and sex and gore and misogyny and all the things I said before, but at least the plot was moving consistently. Not always forward, sometimes backward, sometimes sideways, but at least the plot had a little bit of direction, right? Then Boro dies, and then it just completely relishes in another 35% of this book in the excess that it has built up so far. And it's poorly written. It's absolute trash. I hated this book. I can't say enough bad things about this. The show was fun though. The next book that I read was You Should See Me in a Crown by Leah Johnson. This was another audiobook that I picked up from my library through Libby. And this was really fun. This was really cute. I really needed a palate cleanser, and that's absolutely what this was. Ultimately, I gave it 3 stars because slice of life, young adult contemporary just doesn't really do it for me for the most part. I didn't find myself driven to continue reading it. This ended up being a one-day book for me because by the time I got, I think, to the last 10 or 5% or so, I was getting ready for bed and I realized that I needed to finish it, otherwise I might not pick it back up. It's really adorable. It's really sweet. It's absolutely precious, and I can't say enough really positive things about it. Unfortunately, this genre of book just isn't my cup of tea, but it was absolutely what I needed at the time, and I can't say enough positive things about it. If you're looking for something cute, and I don't want to call it fluffy because it does deal with some very serious topics and it deals with them very well, but if you want something kind of cute and a little bit easier on your palate while still having quite a bit to say and a lot that it says very well, I can't say enough great things about this one. The next book that I finished was Let the Right One In by John Lindquist. This is about a young boy named Oscar, and full spoilers here, his vampire neighbor named Eli, and their friendship and what happens as they become more entangled in each other's lives. This was a 4-star for me. I was really engaged by this. This is probably one of the books that I've had the hardest time putting down this year. It was really, there were a lot of times I was really surprised by how violent and gory this got, and that's always a positive for me more often than not, with, you know, books like Brand New Cherry Flavor kind of being the exception. I thought that this dealt with a lot of very serious topics with a lot of nuance, which I very much appreciated. My husband and I watched this movie a really long time ago. I want to say close to maybe 10 years ago, and we both really loved the movie, and I was so excited to get my hands on a copy of the book, and it really didn't let me down. I want to go back and rewatch the movie now, but I really adored this. There are going to be some trigger warnings on the screen. I'm pretty sure they've probably already popped up, but there will be more down the description. I would definitely look at those before picking this book up because it does have a lot of very serious subject matter in it that is probably going to make it a book not for everyone. But I really enjoyed it, and I think if you're looking for a good wintry spooky read and none of those trigger warnings are going to affect you and your emotional state while reading, I would recommend this one. The next book that I finished was Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado. I picked this one up for 2 reasons. The first reason is I read this for the Buzzword Reading Challenge because the challenge for February was pronouns and possessives, so her absolutely fit in. If you watched my my February TBR. This was not the book I selected for that challenge, but I picked this up because I recommend this for the book club that we do with my husband's parents, and it unfortunately wasn't picked out of all the books that were selected, and I've been putting off reading this because I was gonna recommend it for a book club, and if no one else wanted to read it with me, I was reading it on my own. I loved this. This ended up being 4 stars for me. This is a short story collection that features a lot of different genres, some science fiction, some horror, a little dystopian, a little apocalyptic. This was really incredibly written. There was only one short story in here, I believe it's the one called Mothers, that didn't really do anything for me, that I just didn't really enjoy or connect to in any way. But every other short story in here I thought was absolutely incredible and absolutely blew me away. And I can't say enough positive things about this. I'm looking forward to reading more from this author in the future. The next book that I read is Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. This was another 5-star book for me. This was really so beautiful and so beautifully written. This follows a woman named, I want to get her name right. This follows a woman named Janie throughout her life and it primarily focuses on the romantic relationships she's been involved in, and specifically her marriages. And one of the things I found the most impressive about this is that it didn't really feel like it had truly started until maybe about the halfway point. And I thought that was so impactful because the book doesn't, I won't say the book, it doesn't really start to kind of pick up, or at least it didn't for me, until she found this relationship with Tea Cake that really broadened her world and brightened her world. And I thought it was so beautifully done to have it all kind of be very factual up until that point, and then all of a sudden everything explodes in the prose and in the plot, and it becomes so beautiful and so engaging. And I thought it was just a beautiful reflection of how Janie felt about her life up until that point. I cried at the end of this. This was absolutely incredible. It's worth a read, and it's a classic for a reason. The next book that I read was When the Reckoning Comes by LaTanya Mcqueen. I read this one for the Goodreads Best of Horror for 2021. This was not the one I had initially selected for myself in February, but my library through Libby had the audiobook version of this, and it was one I was super excited about getting to on the list, so I postponed reading what I had planned to pick this one up. This one ended up being 3 stars for me. I thought it was really haunting. It's really good Southern Gothic horror. Ultimately, why it didn't get a higher rating for me is because the plot and the narrative primarily goes between 2 different timelines. It goes from when the characters are around, like, I want to say 15 to 17, somewhere in there, and this major event happens in their life, and then we go forward in time to when they're in like their early 30s, late 20s, and one of them is getting married. And it just felt like we spent so much time in the earlier timeline that when we went forward in time, almost half their lives, they still felt like teenagers to me. It didn't really feel like we were dealing with people who had lived a large portion of their life. They still very much felt like teenagers, and that just really kind of drug it down for me. But this handles a lot of topics of race, of appropriation. This also deals a lot with how we tend to, and I say we as white American people, tend to view the antebellum South in this very romanticized light without really looking at the horrors of it. And I think it handles all of these topics extremely well. The next book that I read was A Touch of Gin by Beth Morgan. This was really fucking weird. This was my perfect kind of weird. I gave this 5 stars. I really loved this. This was another one I picked up through Libby as an audiobook, and I was so confused for so much of it. This follows Alicia and Remy, 2 early 30-somethings that have this very, very disturbing parasocial relationship with this woman named Jen. and how it all kind of devolves horribly. That's about all I can really say about it without going into too much of the weirdness, but it was really strange. It was really weird. I completely understand why a lot of people hate this, but I really loved it. I thought it was fantastic. I thought it was really funny and really ridiculous, and I absolutely loved it. The last book that I read in February is Fearing the Black Body, The Racial Origins of Fatphobia by Sabring. I ended up not rating this book because I ended up not rating this book primarily because it didn't feel like a book that you give a rating to. It felt like a book that you read, you digest the information, and you go on throughout the rest of your life looking at things through a different lens. And I didn't feel like that required a rating to it on Goodreads for basically a reading social media platform. This was really good. This was the last book that we read for our book club for the month of February, and this is pretty much written like a thesis statement or like a thesis paper, and it's absolutely incredible. It was so informative. It was so fascinating and rage-inducing to read, and I really can't recommend this enough if you are very interested in this topic and interested in fatphobia or even medical gaslighting. This is a pretty decent place to start as far as I know. It's one thing that by the end of this book that I don't often at the end of a nonfiction book feel like, oh, well, I want to dig further into these topics. And this really did make me feel like that. I want to do more reading on the racism and Renaissance art in medical gaslighting, specifically for POC and specifically for women of color. It was so fascinating. It was so interesting, and this was another great one for book club. It inspired a lot of discussions, and I know that it was something that all of us really enjoyed. So again, I can't recommend this one highly enough. Those are all the books that I read in February. If you have read any of these and you want to share your opinions, or you completely disagree with my opinions, please leave a comment down below because I would love to see it. I'm going to go take care of my obligations now because I've gone way over the time limit I set for myself. This is a book. Also, don't watch this. Okay, thanks. Bye.